Your heart has been beating without a single break since before you were born. Roughly 2 months before, in fact. Every flight of stairs you've climbed. Every argument that made your pulse race. Every quiet night of sleep, and every night you didn't get one. Every meal, every walk, every decade since. All of it happened with the same organ, working continuously, never once pausing to rest. Here's what almost nobody tells you. The way most people picture a heart attack coming is wrong. Not wrong in a small way. Wrong in the specific detail that decides who gets warning and who doesn't. For half of men and nearly 2/3 of women, the very first symptom of heart disease isn't chest pain. It's sudden death, with no warning sign beforehand at all. This isn't about fear. It's about understanding a mechanism. One the research is far more precise about than the version most people have in their heads. That's what this video is about. No scare tactics, no worst-case scenario. Just the actual biology behind why blockage percentage alone was never the full story. Not a diagnosis. Not a substitute for your own cardiologist. A clearer picture of what's actually happening inside an artery, years before anything shows up on a standard test. Somewhere in the next few minutes, the story most people carry about their own heart is going to shift. Not toward alarm, toward precision. By the end, you'll know the 2 words cardiologists use for the mechanism that actually matters. And the 2 questions worth bringing to your next appointment. Here's what most people believe about heart attacks. A slow, gradual clogging. Like a pipe filling up with buildup over decades, until one day it's finally too blocked. That mental picture, the plumbing model, feels intuitive. It's also not how most heart attacks actually happen. Here's what that picture leaves out. Your coronary arteries don't just sit there and slowly narrow as plaque builds up inside them. They actively respond to that plaque, expanding outward to protect the space blood flows through. For years, sometimes decades, before any narrowing becomes visible. Here's the number worth sitting with. In roughly 70% of heart attacks, the responsible artery was less than 50% blocked beforehand. Not 90%. Not even the halfway point most people assume counts as dangerous. Less than half blocked, and still capable of causing a heart attack. This matters specifically after 50. A clean stress test, or a "you look fine" from a routine checkup, can create real, false reassurance. Those tests are often built around detecting narrowing, the exact thing this mechanism can hide behind. Here's the part that changes the entire conversation. This isn't about a slow pipe finally clogging shut. It's about a specific kind of unstable buildup, tearing open, all at once, often in an artery that never looked seriously narrowed on a scan. There's a reason the plumbing model stuck around so long. It's simple, it's visual, and for decades, it's what a standard angiogram was actually built to measure. Not because doctors were wrong to look for narrowing, because the tools available for most of cardiology's history could only reliably see one part of a more complicated picture. A standard angiogram works by injecting dye into your coronary arteries, then taking an X-ray image of the space that dye fills. That measures the lumen, the open channel blood actually flows through. It says almost nothing about the artery wall itself. That's exactly where the mechanism this video describes actually plays out. For decades, that was simply the best tool available. The lumen became the default proxy for risk, even though it was never the full picture. A stress test carries a related limitation, worth naming honestly. It measures how your heart performs under physical exertion. Looking for signs that blood flow to part of your heart muscle is restricted. That's genuinely useful information. It's also built to detect significant narrowing specifically, the kind that limits blood flow during demand. A vulnerable plaque sitting in an artery that isn't narrow enough to restrict flow can pass a stress test cleanly, right up until the day it ruptures. This matters enormously for how a normal result actually gets interpreted. A past stress test, or an angiogram showing only mild narrowing, often gets communicated as reassurance, understandably. The person walks out believing their risk is low. In many cases, that's accurate. In a meaningful share of cases, it isn't. The test simply wasn't designed to see the specific structure that determines whether a rupture happens. Family history deserves a direct mention too. It changes how much weight this mechanism should carry for any individual person. A parent or sibling with an early heart attack, before 55 for men, 65 for women, is a strong predictor, independent of how someone's own arteries look on a scan today. Genetics appear to influence more than whether plaque forms. Also, how prone that plaque is to the instability this video describes. The question worth sitting with is simple. If narrowing isn't the real warning sign, what is, and how would you actually know? Here's the mechanism, and it starts with something researchers discovered decades ago in 1987, studying arteries directly. As plaque builds up inside a coronary artery, the artery doesn't just sit passively and narrow. It expands outward, growing the outer wall to compensate, specifically to preserve the space blood flows through on the inside. Researchers call this positive remodeling. It's the reason a scan measuring how open an artery looks can miss substantial plaque hiding just behind that wall. This compensation isn't unlimited. Once plaque reaches roughly 40% of the artery's total cross-sectional area, the artery runs out of room to expand. Narrowing finally becomes visible. Before that point, everything can look completely normal on a standard test. Real disease has been building for years underneath. Here's the detail connecting this directly to actual heart attacks. Research using detailed intravascular imaging has found that plaques with this same positive remodeling carry specific features. A large, soft, lipid-rich core. A thin, fibrous cap holding it in place, sometimes only a fraction of a millimeter thick. Researchers call this combination a vulnerable plaque. It behaves differently from the hard, heavily calcified plaque most people picture when they think about blockage. It's worth being precise about why this matters so much. A heavily calcified narrow artery is often more stable than it looks, precisely because it's had time to harden. A vulnerable plaque, soft and thinly capped, can rupture suddenly. It spills its contents into the bloodstream, triggering a clot. The artery blocks within minutes, regardless of how narrow it looked the day before. Researchers named this process after Seymour Glagoff, the scientist who first documented it closely back in 1987. His original work studied arteries directly, at autopsy, comparing plaque size against how much the vessel wall had expanded to compensate. The pattern held consistently. Compensation. Right up until the point it couldn't keep up anymore. This connects to something already familiar from earlier videos here. Even though the organ is different, there's a practical reason this specific mechanism stayed obscure outside cardiology for so long. Seeing it directly requires intravascular imaging, a catheter-based technique threading a tiny ultrasound or optical probe inside the artery, not just photographing it from outside. That's an invasive procedure, reserved for specific clinical situations, not something performed routinely on healthy people simply out of curiosity. Most of what's known about vulnerable plaque comes from research during procedures already happening for another reason, or from autopsy studies examining arteries afterward. Here's a distinction worth understanding. It explains why two people with similar test results can carry very different real risk. Stable angina, chest discomfort following a predictable pattern tied to exertion, tends to link with negative remodeling. Plaques that have already narrowed the artery in a way standard tests detect. Unstable angina and heart attacks themselves lean disproportionately toward positive remodeling instead. The exact pattern this video describes, hiding behind a wall that hasn't visibly narrowed. The clinical picture and the underlying structural picture don't always point the same direction. Part of why this mechanism matters as much as it does. That's exactly the mechanism the rest of this video is built around. Not gradual clogging. Sudden rupture. Often in arteries, nobody was watching closely enough. The artery researchers call the widowmaker, and why location matters. The left anterior descending artery supplies a large share of your heart's muscle, more than any other single coronary vessel. When a vulnerable plaque ruptures there specifically, the outcome is disproportionately severe. Part of why this artery earned an informal name outside medical journals. This isn't about one uniquely dangerous artery. Every coronary artery can develop vulnerable plaque. It's about understanding that location changes the stakes of the same underlying mechanism already explained. Athletes and otherwise healthy, active people aren't automatically protected from this risk either. Worth naming directly, since it surprises people who assume fitness alone rules out serious disease. Cardiovascular fitness and coronary plaque stability are related, but they aren't the same measurement. Two categories of heart attack, and why the distinction matters for understanding risk. Cardiology draws a meaningful line between two different mechanisms, both called heart attacks, but genuinely different underneath. A type 1 heart attack is the rupture mechanism already described. Plaque tearing open, a clot forming, blood flow suddenly cut off. A type 2 heart attack happens differently. No rupture at all. Instead, an existing narrowed artery simply can't keep up with the sudden spike in demand during severe illness, extreme physical stress, or a dangerously fast heart rhythm. This distinction matters because prevention looks different for each one. Type 1 is about plaque stability, the mechanism already explained in detail. Type 2 is about a gap, what your heart needs in a demanding moment versus what a narrowed artery can actually supply. Someone can face meaningful risk from either pathway, or both at once. Part of why this isn't a single simple story. What actually triggers rupture? When the plaque itself has been sitting there for years. Researchers haven't fully mapped every trigger, but several patterns show up repeatedly. Sudden physical exertion, particularly in someone who's been sedentary. Acute emotional stress. The mechanical stress of blood pressure surging against an already thin fibrous cap. None of these create the vulnerable plaque itself. They're closer to the final push against a structure already unstable, sometimes for years beforehand, without a single symptom announcing it. This is part of why some heart attacks appear to come from nowhere. During shoveling snow and intense argument, or a sudden sprint for a bus. The plaque didn't form in that moment. The final trigger simply arrived against a structure that had already been quietly unstable for longer than anyone realized. Why symptoms themselves can look completely different from what most people expect, particularly in women. The chest-clutching collapse most people picture isn't how a rupture always announces itself. This gap matters, given the statistic this video opened with. Women experiencing a heart attack are more likely than men to report symptoms that don't fit the classic picture. Unusual fatigue, sometimes for days beforehand. Shortness of breath without chest pain accompanying it. Nausea, back pain, or jaw discomfort. Easy to mistake for something unrelated entirely. This isn't a minor footnote. It connects directly to why sudden cardiac death is more often the first sign of heart disease in women. Symptoms that don't match the expected pattern get dismissed more easily by the person experiencing them, sometimes by the medical system too, until the mechanism progresses further than it needed to. A detail worth naming about who actually faces the highest risk, since it isn't evenly distributed. Age remains the single strongest risk factor here. Arterial plaque, in most cases, takes decades to develop the size and instability this video describes. But age alone doesn't explain everything. Diabetes, smoking, and high blood pressure each independently speed up plaque development and raise the odds it becomes the unstable, thin-capped variety specifically, not just more plaque overall. This is worth sitting with plainly. Two people with identical total plaque can carry meaningfully different risk levels. It depends on whether that plaque leans stable and calcified, or soft and inflamed. Total plaque burden and plaque stability are related, but not interchangeable. Conflating the two is part of what keeps the plumbing model alive longer than the evidence supports. Here's where the honest, harder question comes in. If narrowing alone doesn't reliably predict risk, what actually does? And how would you find out before a rupture happens, not after? The coronary artery calcium score, a specific type of CT scan, measures calcified plaque directly inside your coronary arteries. It produces a single number. A large meta-analysis of over 92,000 patients found something clear. A calcium score of 0 was linked to a genuinely low annual risk of a major cardiac event. Under 1% whether chest pain was stable or acute. It's worth being honest about the real limitation here. This video hasn't skipped a hard number yet and won't start now. A calcium score of 0 isn't an absolute guarantee. In that same research, 13% of people with stable chest pain and a 0 score still had non-obstructive disease. Younger patients specifically tend to carry more of the soft, non-calcified plaque this scan can't detect. Precisely the kind most associated with the rupture mechanism already explained. Here's the number worth remembering on the other end of the scale. A calcium score above 100 is associated with roughly 7 times the risk of a cardiac event, compared to a score of 0. Above 300, that risk climbs to nearly 10 times. This isn't a vague risk category. It's one of the more precise, individually predictive numbers available in preventive cardiology today. A coronary CT angiogram goes further than the calcium score alone. It directly visualizes both calcified and non-calcified plaque, including the soft, vulnerable kind a calcium score can miss. This is the test capable of actually seeing the structure this video has been explaining. The thin cap and lipid core determining real rupture risk, not just hardened deposits. It's a more detailed test, generally reserved for people with symptoms or elevated risk factors. not a universal first screening step for everyone. Neither test replaces a conversation with a cardiologist about personal risk factors, family history, and whether screening makes sense for you specifically. What both tests offer together is something a stress test alone often can't. A direct look at the actual mechanism this video has been explaining, not an indirect measure of how narrow an artery looks on a given day. Guidelines generally point toward calcium scoring for people in an intermediate risk category, not universally for everyone at every age. Someone in their 30s with no family history and no risk factors is a different conversation compared to someone in their 50s with a parent who had an early heart attack. That distinction is exactly the kind of detail a cardiologist weighs, not a rule to self-apply from a video. What the calcium score test itself actually involves, since uncertainty about a procedure often becomes its own barrier. A coronary calcium scan is a non-contrast CT scan, meaning no injected dye and no needle involved. The scan itself takes only a few minutes, lying still on a table. The radiation dose is roughly comparable to a mammogram, lower than many people assume. There's no fasting requirement beforehand and no recovery time needed afterward. Cost varies by location and insurance coverage. Many facilities offer it as a self-pay option, roughly $100 to a few $100s, often not covered as routine screening. How this connects directly to a decision many people over 50 are already facing: whether to start a statin. A calcium score doesn't only inform curiosity about risk, it's increasingly used to help make an active medical decision. Someone in a borderline category for statin therapy, based on standard risk calculators alone, often faces genuine uncertainty. Is the medication worth starting? A calcium score of 0 in that situation has been used by cardiologists to support reasonably deferring statin therapy, a meaningfully elevated score to support starting it. This is precisely the kind of decision this video keeps returning to, not a vague sense of risk, but a specific number changing a specific, actionable choice. One more honest limitation worth naming before this section closes. Even a coronary CT angiogram, more detailed than calcium scoring alone, isn't a perfect predictor, not of which specific plaque will rupture or when. Predicting the exact moment a vulnerable plaque tears open remains genuinely difficult, even with the most detailed imaging available today. This video isn't presenting these tools as a crystal ball. It's presenting them as considerably more informative than blockage percentage alone. A real improvement, without overstating what even the best tools can promise. There's a reason this channel keeps returning to the same underlying idea. Even in a video about arterial plaque, instead of anything covered before. This connects to territory already covered here through a shared principle rather than a shared organ. Every mechanism this channel has explained involves a structure that looks stable on the surface. Something more specific determines real risk underneath. A gut lining, a blood-brain barrier, or now a thin fibrous cap. It's worth being precise about what this video can and can't claim. It doesn't mean every case of chest tightness is imminent danger. It also doesn't mean a clean stress test guarantees anything close to zero risk. What the evidence supports is narrower. A real, well-documented mechanism, explaining why blockage percentage alone is an incomplete predictor, alongside specific tools that measure something closer to actual risk. It's also worth naming the honesty this video leaned on throughout. The 70% figure connecting rupture to less than 50% blockage is real, published research, not an inflated number. The calcium score's limitations in younger patients are real too, not a minor footnote. Presenting only the reassuring parts of this research, or only the frightening parts, would both be dishonest. That's a deliberate choice this channel keeps making, video after video. A number that cuts both ways, stated plainly, is more useful than a version smoothed over to feel comfortable. It's worth naming something else directly. This channel has spent a dozen videos on food and gut health before ever reaching the heart. Plaque stability itself isn't fixed once it forms. The same inflammatory processes already discussed in earlier videos are part of what researchers believe shapes plaque type. The same ones connecting gut health to systemic inflammation. This isn't a claim that any single food reverses existing plaque. It's a reminder that this video's mechanism doesn't exist in isolation, not from everything else this channel has already explained. Statins deserve a direct, honest mention too. They've become central to modern cardiology's answer to this exact mechanism. Their primary documented benefit isn't simply lowering a cholesterol number on a lab report. Research increasingly points toward a stabilizing effect on existing plaque itself, thickening the fibrous cap and shrinking the lipid core in some studies. The precise structural changes expected to reduce rupture risk. That's a different benefit than most people assume hearing cholesterol medication. It connects directly to what makes a plaque dangerous. None of this replaces personalized medical guidance, and this video isn't recommending statin therapy for anyone specifically. It's naming why that conversation with the cardiologist is worth having with this mechanism in mind. Not cholesterol numbers alone. Exercise deserves its own honest mention too. Its relationship to this mechanism is more nuanced than more is always better. Regular moderate activity remains broadly protective. Still, sudden, unaccustomed intense exertion in someone sedentary for a long stretch appears in some research as a situational trigger, capable of pushing an already vulnerable plaque toward rupture, the same category discussed earlier. There's a fair question worth asking before this closes. Why hasn't this made it into more routine conversations at a standard checkup? Part of the answer is simply logistics. Calcium scoring and CT angiography aren't universal screening tools the way blood pressure checks are. A short annual appointment rarely has room to explain a mechanism this specific. That's not a hidden secret. It's a gap between what's known and what fits into a 10-minute visit. There's a second, more structural reason worth naming honestly. Guidelines around calcium scoring have shifted meaningfully over the past decade, from a niche research tool toward a mainstream recommendation for intermediate-risk patients. Clinical practice across an entire healthcare system tends to catch up to guideline changes slowly, not because any doctor is behind, but because updating practice at scale takes years. Someone reaching this video today may simply be encountering research that hasn't fully filtered into standard practice yet, even where the evidence is well established. This is worth connecting to the same broader pattern already familiar from earlier videos on this channel. New mechanisms discovered in research tend to reach the public slowly and unevenly, in the gut, the brain, or here, the heart. Filtered through specialty journals most people never read, long before becoming routine conversation at an annual physical. There's one more honest thing worth saying here. Why a video, rather than a doctor's appointment, is often where this mechanism gets explained clearly for the first time. A 10-minute visit is built for triage, not education. A cardiologist deciding whether to order a calcium score has limited time left over. Time to also walk through positive remodeling, vulnerable plaque, and the type 1 versus type 2 distinction. That explanation takes the kind of time this video just spent on it. Neither the doctor nor the patient is at fault for that gap. It's simply a structural mismatch between how detailed this mechanism is and how short a routine visit tends to be. If this mechanism was new to you, follow this channel. New videos connecting research exactly like this arrive every few days. Go back to where this video started. A heart that hasn't stopped since before you were born. A warning system that often doesn't activate before the first symptom. True for half of men, nearly 2/3 of women. You now know why. Not a slow pipe, finally clogging shut. An artery expanding outward for years, hiding plaque behind a wall that eventually runs out of room. Not blockage percentage alone. The stability of a specific kind of plaque, thin-capped and lipid-rich. One that can rupture regardless of how narrow an artery looked before. Two real specific tools too. A calcium score and a coronary CT angiogram, measuring something closer to the actual mechanism than a standard stress test ever could. None of this replaces a conversation with a cardiologist, and none of it means everyone needs every test available. It means the conversation can be a more specific one. Bring the two specific terms this video introduced: positive remodeling, vulnerable plaque. Naming the actual mechanism tends to shift a conversation from a generic checkup into a genuinely useful one. A realistic version of that conversation might sound like this: asking directly whether a calcium score makes sense given your specific age, family history, and existing risk factors. Asking what a 0 score would and wouldn't rule out, given the limitations already explained in this video. Asking whether a coronary CT angiogram is worth considering instead, particularly for anyone younger with a strong family history where non-calcified plaque is more likely relevant. None of this requires memorizing every number in this video. It requires walking in with two specific questions instead of none, and enough context to actually understand the answers. Not, do I have a blockage? Closer to, what does my plaque stability actually look like? It was about a second, more specific question sitting underneath it. One that decides far more about who gets a warning than blockage percentage ever could. Send this to someone who's been told their arteries look fine. Someone who's never heard stable and vulnerable plaque told apart this directly. Leave a comment letting us know if this changes how you think about your next checkup. There's a good chance the research has more to say about it than you'd expect. Think back to how this video opened. A heart that has never once stopped, working through every ordinary day of your life without you noticing. What's changed now isn't the biology itself. It was running exactly the same way before this video and after it. What's changed is what you have now. A name for the actual mechanism. The real numbers behind it, honestly presented. And two specific questions worth bringing to your next appointment instead of one incomplete one. Your heart was never just counting down toward a blockage. It was quietly managing something far more specific than that. The entire time. This video is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical advice. Always consult a cardiologist about personal risk factors and appropriate screening.